I think I'm okay.
Okay. So people want to check in while we're waiting for others? Susan, you want to check in?
Check in. I've been doing a lot. I've been doing a lot of destructive gardening today, and I've been attacking my Akiba. That's what I've been doing today.
I see Eva next.
Hi, I just, I'm having a kind of a day where I'm getting nothing done.
It can be nice.
No,
Carol?
what if you plan to?
Yeah. Well, I got a lot done. We filled up Bernie's truck in my car and took the last of all of the junk that was in the garage to Goodwill. So the only thing that's left there is trash and somebody's old TV that I refused to carry for them to the curb. And then after that, I went for a nice long bike ride. So I just got back.
Good for you.
Rowan or Ninian? Okay, well, I'll take that as a pass. Walter?
Well, I'm pretty excited. This is my third of 4 Zoom calls today. But this one should be one of the more creative, interesting.
Yeah. Scott?
Yep, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to getting some feedback on all Chris's good work here. See what people think.
So I got invited on a hike in the Blue Hills with a architectural historian colleague who was tracking down First Nation sites, indigenous peoples' markers. We didn't get very far. We got tuckered out. But it was fun nonetheless. How you doing, Chris?
Doing well. Busy week where the office is buzzing along, so it feels good.
No slump for you guys.
No, it seems like we're busier now than we have been in past years about this time. So I think what it is everybody's at home looking at their landscape and wanting it to be a little bit nicer than what it is. So, or seeing the potential in their backyard, one of the two.
Yeah. So. And then we have Ann and Dick. I'm happy you can join us. How are you guys doing?
Only very briefly.
Hi. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, well, let's jump into it then.
Sure.
Take it away, Chris.
Well, some of this is going to be repetitious for some of you, so I'm sorry for that. But where we are right now is we are looking at we will be looking at a preliminary schematic package that has had some review from committee members, but we're looking to have a larger group of people giving some feedback, which will take us to our next step. Our next step is developing this package a little bit more in detail. It would still remain somewhat schematic, but some of the details will be more resolved. The landscape plan itself will be more resolved and more buildable. You're going to see some things that are very sketchy and loose. It's not a final design. And that's where we need the feedback from as far as where we are now. Are we hitting the mark for needs, wants, and desires, along with really what is the focus of this are some serious structural and drainage issues. So with that, I'll jump into a little bit of how we got to where we are. Zen was initially invited to develop a package for the East End, where we were looking at both aesthetic concerns and engineering concerns. We understand that the genesis for us being brought into the project was because there was significant subsidence at the threshold to several residences that caused unsafe conditions, water draining into the building, those sorts of problems. We went through several very productive meetings. It was a very positive process where we developed in more depth solutions, a kit of parts solutions that responds to your community values, and also addressed the aesthetic and engineering considerations for the East End. After we developed a package similar to what we're going to look at this afternoon, we received a bunch of feedback, which is really the important bit at this stage. And that feedback included things like Zen comes to your community from the outside, so there are certain things that were valued, things that that you guys see that I don't see, and it was sort of that coming together that developed the plan into both a plan that addressed the aesthetic and engineering concerns, but that also really dovetailed into what the community needs and wants, and how in your lifestyle, essentially. So we got to a second wave of that that iteration. We developed the plans, and more importantly, or an important part of that presentation was also developing budgeting, so that your community can begin to look at prioritizing some of these projects and how they fit into a larger scheme of things. So what has happened since this particular package was discussed in committee with some of the committee members is that we have reached out to a civil engineer who will team with to develop the kit of parts solutions for some of the drainage issues that we looked at. And along with that, we'll develop a second presentation that is much more refined and looks at the landscape in a much more complete way. So with that, taking a look at this image that you see in front of you now, our title page, these are, again, I'm coming from the outside, so these are things that I see that drew my attention about your community, whether it's things like in the upper left, the play structure or ornament within the site, some of the major features like the spine corridor, entrances, those sorts of things. So for me, this is kind of a mood board for a first impression of Cambridge Co-housing West End. Then we ended up going into some analyses. Landscape architects will often, in a planning phase, start to break out areas so that they can be named, examined for kit of parts, those sorts of things, but also evaluated in terms of how these individual pieces interact with one another and the spaces that they create. So this diagram shows really some key features, including exclusive use areas, common areas like the community terrace here, a key feature of your community such as the spine and the circulation through the site. Also looks at things like primary entrances, structures within the site, those sorts of things. Parking in this area is also kind of a bit of a key feature of the landscape. So from that, just breaking it down into component parts, we started to analyze those parts. And this is really meant to be sort of a no-holds-barred look at when somebody who does not know anybody at a site or anything about that. These are the things that I, as a designer, see that are that can be improved, let's say. Those include things like, let's see, the trash enclosure and some trash that's off to the side over here. There are also areas where kayaks are deposited randomly, composting bins, a fairly unsightly view to the commuter rail. There are some areas that could be built upon, such as this community gathering space. where tables and community events happen. A main entry into this building could be a little bit more pleasing. On the bottom, we see some failures in construction details. In this instance here, crumbling and failing pavements that have been patched, and that's pretty much all throughout the site. There's also some failing retaining walls or retaining walls that have been patched. And one of the things that I would say is probably my harshest criticism, and please don't take this the wrong way, but there's a lot of clutter in certain areas of the property. A lot of these are personal use areas, but I think that we can begin to address those as well as addressing some of the engineering challenges that we have. So that's the aesthetic conditions diagram. And please, at any time, if anybody has a question or a comment, please stop me and chime right in. I'm trying to roll along a little quickly so that we have a lot of time for discussion. This next diagram is really a motivating factor for what we're doing here. And these are the engineering conditions diagrams. And these are kind of the serious things that we are trying to solve with solutions that are aesthetic and pleasing, and sort of marrying an engineering approach with a design approach. So here we have a bunch of things that are not necessarily bad, like maintaining venting at the parking structure was something that we identified as something we needed to maintain. Amenities that individual homeowners are using, such as rain barrels at downspouts. Then it gets into more challenging things like overflowing drainage that goes to an adjacent property. This is a concern because it's not only is it kind of not very pleasing, but it's also you're legally not allowed to do that. So it's something that that we would need to address anyway. We have low points and potential for flooding in some of the rear areas, some steep access paths. In this area, there's existing planting, and behind that, there's a retaining wall that probably traps some rainwater and moisture within there. One of the other things that we looked at was accessibility, and accessibility in terms of making things universally accessible, which means allowing for wheelchairs and those sorts of things. And there are particular guidelines for slopes and material surfaces that we would have to be aware of.
Excuse me, Chris.
Yeah.
I don't understand why that particular walkway is inaccessible.
It's inaccessible because it exceeds the slope that's allowed for an accessible walkway.
It's almost flat.
It slopes down to the street. So when I looked at the grading plan, there's another walkway. If you can see on where I'm pointing right here, there's another walkway that comes into that part of this sloped walkway that's greater than 2%, which isn't allowed by code. So that's something that we would look at.
You can look at it, but this is the way the building is built, and you can't raise the street or lower the building.
That's true, but we do have solutions that would look into that. And there's also, Scott, I don't know how much, if at all, we want to get into when you're doing a building project and you get to a certain percentage of the value of the property, you would need to bring everything up to meet current code. I don't know if we want to get into that right now, but
is that true for infrastructure projects where it's crucial infrastructure? I mean, if we kept this to crucial infrastructure, do you still have to do that?
It would be for any project where you're going above a percentage of the cost of the building. The public portions of the building would need to meet current ADA code.
I mean, well, let me just chime in a little. Nick, what they typically would do is we just do it in phases. We'd pick a phase to fix one area this year, another area next year. If we submit a plan to do all of these things at once, then everything's going to kick in, ADA compliance for everything. I just think it's smart to look at the walkway from the street on that entrance and the other entrance a little further down to make them compatible and meet the code for a lot of different reasons that we can get into in another discussion. But it's smart to just get the right pitch. If you're going to dig up the walkway in front of the in front of the main building, in front of the
Dining room.
west end, in front of the west end, if you're going to do that area, the patio, it's very little extra cost additional to do the other walkway. So,
but that it's well, okay. I just don't see. This was one of the things that I was really confused about in this diagram, and to Ann's point too. Like, you know, it's going the main walkway that we have that goes from the entryway to the common house and out to the street and goes to the you know, to the other side. It's under the building. We're not going to make it not under the building.
I think he's just talking about the pitch. I don't think it's going to change the location.
How could, to Ann's point though, how could you change the pitch of something that is currently a covered walkway that has a constant pitch from the building to the street?
You could, this is where the design development comes into play, and you know, you could pitch the walkway to a landing, and the landing would solve the issue of the cross slope pitch at the secondary walk that would allow that to happen. There are solutions that are here, and it's not large gestures to make it ADA accessible. The one thing, just to get back, Scott, I'm not sure whether there is a term, and by term I mean a period of time, that we would need to look at in terms of the projects if you want to space them out not to meet code. I think it's more than a year. I don't think you can do a project 1 year and then another project the next year, because it kicks in over a certain amount of months. That's more than 12.
I don't know if this is the right time to say this, but I think that for parts of this to be accepted by the community, it's going to be really important to talk in terms of phases and be really clear what those phases are.
Sure.
And as we get, I realize we're not prioritizing anything today, at least I don't think we are. Community buy-in is going to be really specific about that.
Yeah, right. And I think in the last meeting we had, we really did talk about that in detail, and we're talking about getting the feedback from the unit owners in the common house, in the flats, how they feel about the front of their space. That was really the area that was going to be focused on first, between the surfacing, the drainage, the planters, all of that stuff was the main quote unquote project to start with, I think.
And I believe, Chris, you were asked to, or you suggested that you present a phasing diagram today.
Yeah, I do have a phasing diagram towards the end of the project, towards the end of the presentation.
We look forward to that. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to move on if there's nothing else right now.
This will come back, I'm sure.
I'm sure it will. So then we had some areas of failing and patched retaining walls at the front along the street. The secondary entrance is also currently inaccessible. And I understand better now that there's also some issues with getting trucks in through here and service vehicles. So as we address that, that will be part of the design development process. The next 3 images, or 4 images rather, are the numerous paving types and patches that are failing. There's some instances where in this particular area, if you can see that, there's a significant tripping hazard. Things have subsided significantly. So addressing that would probably be a good thing for this go around. There's some lighting. The site lighting on this on the west end is not bad. It could probably be improved. And if we're looking at some improvements in other areas, it might be nice to do this comprehensively, which is what we did on the east end. There are some spaces that are inaccessible. They are, in this instance, this patio here is a private patio. It's a community value issue, really, about whether you want all of these spaces to be accessible, even if they are private spaces. And then lastly, just a look at, with the failing of retaining walls at the street side, I also wanted to look at other retaining walls and kind of evaluate them to see where they are structurally. I know this retaining wall in particular has kind of a little bit of a precarious guardrail on top, and that might be a liability that you guys look at and improve. So those were engineering conditions. And then the next page, what we did for the East End, which I thought was really helpful in understanding your community, was just to look at your website in terms of what are the community values that you have. And I won't run through all of this, but in the middle, and again, this is from you guys, this is not from us, is that co-housing is an intentional community of private homes clustered around shared space. And they serve to, create several unique green spaces and strike a balance between social interaction and privacy. I think that those core values are what's going to hopefully influence the buy-in for the community when we talk about what is a shared cost and what is a private cost. Particularly because some of the things that are needed for the greater good of the community would address private areas that in all likelihood should be addressed at the same time as the common areas. Along with that, we identified two particular issues that are space oriented. One is the idea of creating these nodes of common areas that encourage socializing. And the second is the spine that runs through the entire community, and that kind of unites the residents and into a larger community. So in some ways, the idea of breaking this up into the East End and the West End is artificial, because we're going to need to merge those in coming efforts to help you prioritize some of these projects. So through the lens of your community values, we developed what we called a kit of parts landscape solutions. They're precedents that we can look to draw into your community to either define space or to address engineering concerns. In this instance, I'm looking at the community terrace shared spaces where there's a shared cooking corner or barbecue corner. You guys have a barbecue there, so that's something that you might look into. Specialty paving at a community terrace to indicate that it's a shared space. On the lower right here, looking at a shade canopy to make the spaces as comfortable as they possibly can to encourage the gatherings that are part of your lifestyle. And then things like built-in seating or something along those lines that help to give character to these common areas. The next set of things we looked at were things like paving. In this instance, we looked at permeable pavers that would allow for infiltration. You're seeing examples of permeable paving in what I'm calling an ombre pattern or a shadow pattern. These areas have open joints that allow water infiltration. There's something here that gives you a little bit of a sense of what that paving assembly looks like in a construction detail. And I think this paving system could work throughout the site. And it will be particularly important on the areas where the terraces are on top of the parking garage to keep water flowing through that area. After you do all of your work with the waterproofing in the garage, making sure that the surface treatments support all of the work that you've done, I think will be an important consideration. Moving down to the next area, we looked at rainwater management, stormwater management, and this is where we'll be engaging with the civil engineer to look at the broad concepts that Zen has developed for rain management, including things like rain gardens, where water is channeled to a low. Hello.
Hello.
Susan,
Hi, can I speak to Joan? This is Joan. Hi, Joan. My name is Joey. I'm calling from the Air Department at Lindblad Expedition.
I thought I had a question there. I was all excited. So getting back to rain gardens, the idea of draining everything to a planted area that's a little bit more ecological. Those rain gardens have overflow valves to make sure that they don't become a problem in and of themselves. We also looked at infiltration galley systems. I believe on the east end you guys have one of these systems. I'm not sure on the west end whether you have them or not.
Okay, thank you.
And also some idea of rain barrels, which could be a key feature throughout the site. We also looked at some more decorative things like fences, concrete unit retaining walls, if we need to address the retaining walls that are existing there now. Zen, one of the things that we bring into the landscape a lot for structuring the landscape, but also bringing in the idea of nature. Boulder setting is very important to us. So using boulders as both an aesthetic element, but also an engineering element or a site furnishings element. Those are solutions.
Kids who'd love to climb those boulders.
I beg your pardon?
There'd be some kids who'd love to climb those boulders if you could.
I bet. See, there you could get into alternative play structures too, which we examined a little bit in the East End. So yeah, they're very useful. Boulders are a fun thing to play with. Then we looked at things like storage, perhaps opportunities for providing either communal storage spaces, like a ganged storage unit here, or individual unit storage bins that are kind of a little bit more consistent on private terraces. That would be more of an aesthetic consideration than anything else. Also looked at things like the kayaks. There are several kayaks throughout the site, so maybe having a central place for them, a central place for bikes, and kind of addressing the trash enclosure area as well. Planters were a key feature of the terraced areas on the west end. Weight is an issue. We looked at perhaps a solution where planters are smaller on wheels, which would give you a little bit more flexibility. I see the ability to keep exclusive use areas exclusive when they want to be, but the potential of moving around planters so that if you have a community event, community space can expand and contract with the use of something that's a little bit more mobile. On the right, you just see a couple of quick thoughts on site lighting. LED path, LED lighting is becoming very popular, and this is also an ecologically sensitive way of providing lighting. So then we get into this drawing, and this drawing is pretty much the drawing we've been discussing for the lion's share of committee meetings and things, and some feedback. And what this is I really want to emphasize that this is very diagrammatic. It's whether this spine comes here, or whether the spine comes here, or whether the spine comes along there. That's not as relevant right now as sort of the broad ideas that are being presented here. So I'll tackle this area first and briefly. We looked at identifying spaces that were key. One of them is the primary entry court. In this instance, we had a brief discussion about how the path would always be along the building, and there's no reason to change it. But in this instance, if we were to change it, that would alleviate some of the issues regarding ADA.
Can I ask a clarifying question about that diagram right where you're looking at?
Sure. Yep.
How are you planning on removing the roof sections that are there currently in order to create that garden space? Because that garden space you're showing is below a roof.
Correct. Yep. We wouldn't have to do that.
So why would you put a garden below a roof?
Well, it's pulling away from the walkway that allows the garden space to be
okay, but the light issues for a garden space,
and you can that can have shade plants that are within it, forest plants that would sort of bring what's happening.
But there's a difference between partial shade and like the full shade that a literal roof is, and I just don't understand doing planting in somewhere that a roof is. I guess I'm not a landscape designer, but it just doesn't make any sense to me that you would take an existing walkway that it's a covered walkway and turn it into a shade garden.
The issue there is not turning it into the garden. The issue there is, what is motivating the shift in the walkway is the ADA accessibility issue. And there are certainly ways that you can build a shade garden in the location that's presented here. So for me, the question is the ADA issue, not the garden under a roof issue.
Sorry, but what about the fact that that's a covered walkway that has a functional purpose, which is that like you have a covered walkway to the street? I mean, that was designed for a reason, and so you're taking that away now.
Correct. I mean, we could keep the walkway there. That is an option. That doesn't solve the ADA accessibility issue, which is what this diagram starts to do. So what I'm hearing is I need to develop an alternate solution that solves the ADA issue.
Yes, I guess what I'm wondering is, I mean, this is an existing structure, right? And what you said was, the ADA stuff. There's a question of whether you have to do it and whether you want to do it. And we can, as a community, have discussions about whether we want to do it, and we have not had that discussion yet in terms of how we want to address any potential ADA issues within the law as we're required to. The question of whether we have to do it is something separate that isn't being answered in this discussion.
Is it something that you want to address, or do you just not want to address
well,
it?
you said that we can't address it because it has to do with the price of the total property, the cost of the value of the total property. Sure.
Well, there are two separate paths. One path is if it is if you do reach the threshold of a certain percentage, you would be required to do it. That is a legal obligation.
Right.
There is the second path, which is the path of what is the best practice in design.
Yeah, whether you want to whether you want to do it because you want to make the community more accessible. I mean, that's a genuine,
Sure.
idea. That's a genuine desire that we could have as a community.
Sure.
But there are trade-offs. So there are trade-offs in this design, right? I mean, by designing to ADA compliance here versus how it was currently, like that space was clearly not designed to be ADA compliant. And so by moving it to ADA compliance, you're dramatically reducing the square footage of like the front lawn, for instance. And so that is an actual, that seems like a discussion that should be had as the community in terms of whether we want to change the face of our community that dramatically.
Sure. Sure, absolutely. I would also add to the discussion, and something to be aware of is if you are in a position where you are addressing these landscape concerns, regardless of whether the legal threshold forces you into full compliance. If you choose not to be compliant with ADA and you're within the law specifically for building, that doesn't, and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't necessarily solve this issue for you, but it does open you up to, in condos, the public space is considered public, even though it's a privately owned space. So you do open yourself up for litigation if somebody comes down the road and says, I can't buy a house here because it's not accessible. So there are a couple things at play. There's the do you want to, are you legally obligated to, and is it the right thing to do? I can't make those decisions for you. I can guide you, and I can tell you that best practice for a landscape architect would be to make it universally accessible.
Sorry, what do you mean by universally accessible?
In the American with Disabilities Act, there's accessible, and there's also universally accessible. Accessible.
Like if all paths are accessible versus if there's one path that's accessible.
No, universal accessibility is basically equivalent to wheelchair accessibility.
Oh.
You can have an ADA accessible walkway or an ADA compliant walkway that has steps, for instance. That is not universally accessible, but is compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Can I ask you a question about our existing walkways? If you were to take the path going straight from the all the way down from the bottom. No, sorry, you're going to the side. No, from the street. If you were to walk from the street to the building, would you trigger from the street? No, not that one. The main entrance. Yes, that one. If you were to walk from the street to the building under the covered walkway, is that ADA compliant?
I would have to double check that, but if I remember correctly, it's not, or it's really close to being out of compliance.
But I thought that the one you were worried about was the one going to the side.
There is in the existing. Let me scroll up here. This path right here is not compliant.
But so
there are also the geometries of how all of these paths come together.
Mm-hmm.
I would have to double check them to make sure that they are compliant. And the threshold, the reason why this walkway is not compliant, for instance, is that it exceeds 2% on the slope as it comes into this walkway.
So it seems like you could redesign that particular walkway without moving the walkway out from under the covered pathway.
Yes, that's a design development. Yes, yeah. That's a design development issue.
So that's fine. Yeah, I mean, looking at the diagram we're looking at now, I mean, to me, it really makes no sense to completely change that covered walkway. But I can understand changing the pathway to the side in order to make it compliant. makes
Which
more
would
sense.
mean changing the main walkway. You would have to,
You would
regardless
just
of
have
what
it
the
come in from a higher. You could have it. I mean, it would just. There's a lot of that going off in that direction. There's a long way that you can work with in terms of making something have a more gentle grade, because you're looking at a rise over a long period there.
It's the and I don't think we necessarily need to get into the nitty gritty of it now, but essentially the walkway is a consistent slope from around this point down to that point, if I remember correctly. That means that this entire length of walkway that is underneath the porch would not be able to have a secondary path coming off of it because it does not meet.
You can't have a landing.
The 2%.
Yeah.
The 2% cross slope issue. So this was a very gestural drawing that was meant to say, well, maybe we simplify the paths here. And on top of that, if we go back to what's existing there now, this is very awkward circulation in through here anyway. So the thought was to simplify that circulation.
I don't see why that's more awkward than the change, which has you no longer walking in a straight line to the building.
I don't know how to respond to that, to be honest.
It's design decisions, and I think that there's different, you can have different goals. Anyway, this isn't my top priority, and I have to go, so I want to ask you things that I actually I care more about, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The patio drainage issue is our sort of the primary reason why we're doing this project, as you know.
Yep.
And I just don't see in here the plan for, if there is a plan on doing any changes in grade in order to improve the drainage in the patio, or what other water remediation things are happening other than the material of the surface membrane. I'm just curious what the thinking is on that.
That's a design. That's where we get into design development, and we would look at specifically do a deeper dig into a grading plan, which is
so. Is the grading plan something? I mean, this is what you've shown us is what is it if it's not design development?
It's schematic. This is schematic design.
Schematic design. So schematic design does not include looking at the drainage problems.
We have looked at the drainage problems. It doesn't include fine grading. No.
So I don't mean fine grading. I just mean in general, what is the philosophy of grading that we're going to be looking at for this project? I just don't see it anywhere, because these are all, bird's eye view diagrams. I don't see any sort of plan for how we're changing, the structure in a way that makes it so the water flows better.
That is not where we are in the design process at the moment. This is really broad.
Have we already paid for that, or is that something that we need to pay for?
It's basic.
It's part of the process. It's kind of where we are now, is to talk about the schematic things, get to a point where we give you a schematic drawing, and then we dive into the finer points like a fine grading plan. What we've done.
I'm just confused, because I thought that what we were doing at this point was looking at grading in a way that, we're trying to solve a specific problem, and I just don't see the solution to that problem in this diagram.
If I may,
yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I have an awareness of the fact that one of the chief goals of the civil engineers working with Charles Smith Restoration is to drop the level of the patio as much as possible, so that the garage roof patio is as low as possible below the floor level of the units, while still allowing a wheelchair universal access to the bottom floor.
Which is a half an inch. That's a half an inch.
Right. So the jury is still out on what they're going to be able to achieve. Once they establish that within the, and still be able to fit the sandwich of materials for drainage, that will set the elevation of that front edge of where the patio meets the Pretty Good Lawn. And then the baton gets passed to Zen Associates.
Is there anything that we're doing other than drainage, other than, I mean, are we doing any sort of like drain tiles or anything like that as drainage solutions, or are we just doing drainage with grade?
Below the surface treatment?
Yeah.
On top of the garage?
Yeah.
The intention, if we go back to the kit of parts, is this permeable paving assembly where there is free draining, there's a free draining medium beneath the terraces, which is what I'm proposing. There were some discussions about having these things on pedestal, and I just don't see that as being a viable solution myself. But
what do you mean on pedestal?
Pedestal is a system where you have larger pavers that are literally held up on the corners are literally held up on a pedestal. And there's an airspace between the paver and the top of the garage unit.
Okay, and sorry, I'm sorry that I'm kind of monopolizing. I'm gonna have to go as soon as I ask this last question. But is there any plan for the existing tree boxes? How are those being handled?
Right now, our proposal, Zen is proposing that we've had this conversation looking at other solutions. I think they're going to be problematic.
What about the trees themselves? I know that we're not going to be able to keep those boxes, but what are we going to do with those trees?
It's really soon in the design process to talk about that. Are you talking about, are we going to reuse them, or what are you?
I mean,
what is your question?
Like, is it possible to? How many trees are we going to lose in this diagram, and how many are we of the ones we're losing are going to be able to be saved on site? Is that like? I mean, that seems like it is at this stage because you're looking at how you're going to redesign this. You should be
no, it's a little early for that. That would probably be in the next round of design development, and the next plans would capture some of these comments. I honestly can't give you a number of trees that would be saved versus ones that would go. I can say practically and pragmatically, saving the trees might not be the best solution, and replacing them might be a better, more cost-effective solution than trying to save them.
I just want to say that I think one of our fundamental problems in this process has been the lack of understanding for some of us about where we go from the Smith work to your work. And from you, Chris, we're seeing these beautiful pictures, some of which some of us are looking at and saying, there's no way we're going to spend that money, that we don't have that money. So if we were to understand better what's happening to really fix the issues we have here, and then we talked more about the aesthetics of it, I think for some of us it would make more sense. And I do understand there has to be a broad picture, but some of this is so far beyond what, it is beautiful, but it is so far beyond what we're going to be able to do that it gets really frustrating to be going at it the way we are. I understand it's too soon to talk about the trees in the boxes, but you also, or whoever is doing our design, needs to understand those trees are really important. And so it's, I'm saying a lot of different things at once, I realize, and I've been coming and going because I have no choice right now. But I just think that that's a fundamental flaw in how we're going about this. And I understand you're trying to address it, but it's not working for some of us.
I think one of the things about process that we can talk about more in depth is that it's not a design, whether it's landscape architecture or architecture, is never a situation where, say, an engineer does their thing and then that's part one, and then part two is the landscape architect or the architect comes in and does something else. It's very much a conversation back and forth, and the way it works in this instance is that now that we do have a civil engineer, which we didn't at the beginning. At the beginning, it was really identifying what the issues are, which is a significant achievement. Looking at them holistically so that you're not looking at one piece, solving one piece that may, in fact, down the road, prohibit you from doing something else that is just important or just as much of a concern, such as ADA. So the idea is to look at things holistically, come up with solutions, and then work collaboratively with the civil engineer to achieve the solutions that we've done, or the solutions that we've presented. So it's not it's very important to understand from the design process that it's not something where it's like, okay, the civil engineer is going to do something, they're going to solve everything, and then the landscape architect is going to come in and make it pretty. That's certainly not how design works. Design works hand in hand with the designer and the engineer finding the solution that best fits a myriad of issues, not just the aesthetic issues, or not just the engineering issues.
And I understand that. I think that it is the other part that's lacking, not that yours is wrong, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's our problem in the way the committee is presenting it.
And you're saying that for you, you're uncomfortable with that because the civil engineer is coming after the landscape architect?
Yes.
And that's typically how it works, is that the landscape architect does do design work, and the civil engineer then works with the designer to do the subsurface work. Typically for landscape architects, and I can also say that I have talked to the civil engineer about that Scott put me in contact with about this project in particular. And the civil engineer, rarely does the civil engineer want to do surface drainage, and rarely does the landscape architect want the civil engineer to do surface drainage. So what typically happens is that the landscape architect does grades the site, sets slopes and things like that to area drains or drains, and then the civil engineer picks up all of subsurface systems. If it's not done that way, it's unusual. So what we've done here is we've looked at creating, like I said, the kit of parts that solves both the engineering issues and the aesthetic issues. And now we're at a point where we are ready to take this diagram to the next level and also coordinate with the civil engineer the nuts and bolts aspect of drainage systems. So that gets layered in the design development process.
I think, for me anyway, I still need to understand better, and this is not your job, but I need to understand what we're doing to solve the drainage issues. And I've listened very carefully to what you've said. I understand the reasoning behind some of it, but I think maybe it's just our failing here for not talking more about how we're solving the drainage issues.
Chris, if I may interrupt, this is Walter. I think Anne is onto something in the sense that it's probably appropriate for us to try to present the story of the engineering project. On the other hand, I think what I'm feeling is that some or many community members feel like the drainage issue and the engineering are essential and have to be done, and the landscape is, in a sense, cosmetic, and something that people want to be very careful about what we're spending money on. I think that's an incomplete view, but I think we probably have to address it first by getting people comfortable with what we are solving and how we're trying to solve it from an engineering standpoint, and then bring in the landscaping as a complement to the, in other words, we're ripping up the patio and we have to improve the drainage off the patio. And that's an open invitation to a discussion of what we're going to put there. But I think people may have the feeling, help me, there's a lot of people on this call that perhaps we need to be more explicit and clear and articulate about what the engineering project consists of and what it will solve.
I think you're saying that correctly, Walter. And I would say that I certainly understand that the patio is getting ripped up. We have to figure out what's going to happen to that, and you're a part of that process. But getting pictures of, and this is the third time I've seen this, of fixing the trash enclosure and all this right now is just not important. I mean, I understand once it's presented as a whole picture, but then after that, we have so much before we get to that kind of thing.
Sure, and the intention of this go around is to look at the broad brush and then narrow things down to the more specific. And I would also go back to say and to reiterate that the engineering that you're referring to is not put into separate silos. If we're going to talk specifically about the private terraces that are along the building facade, the surface drainage for that and the surface drainage solution for that comes from Zen Associates. The walkways and making them accessible comes from Zen Associates. Any drainage that is surface drainage for lawn spaces, parking areas, anything like that is engineering that Zen does. It's the engineering that, and I'll take Zen out of the picture. It's the engineering that a landscape architect does. The work that a civil engineer does is subsurface work. It is the systems that when a landscape architect drains a patio to a particular low point, that's when, and indicates that there's an area drain there, that's when the civil engineer picks that area drain up, and then puts it into a system that's below grade. So you can't necessarily separate the two. Even in an engineering firm where there is an engineering department and a landscape architecture department, the landscape architecture department is always taking the lead in terms of the surface drainage and getting it to drainage areas. So where we are now is looking at sort of the broad brush diagrams of how we're going to achieve these sorts of things, what tools we have available to us for water infiltration, permeable pavings and things like that. They're not just things that are aesthetic. For instance, the permeable paving issue is solving the issue of both the aesthetic concern and the engineering concern. It's not in a separate silo that says that, you know, landscape is just making something pretty, because what we do really does encompass a whole lot more than just making something pretty. And, you know, I'm very aware of what the concern is and what the driving issues are on the West End, which are different than on the East End. And I think that in the East End process, we also ended up sort of running into the same concerns about understanding the role of allied professionals in attacking a problem such as this. And I think we got to a point where we had solved that concern a bit, and gave a complete picture of how to address the site. And then from that point of addressing, at looking things holistically, you can then determine what the process is and what the next steps are in terms of a construction project. I'd like to continue on that path because I think that that's a successful path. I don't think that it's going to be successful to look at individual pieces, try to solve an individual piece at the cost of perhaps the cost of not being able to solve other problems by having blinders on and just looking at one individual concern. We did have a discussion in the committee about, there were some views here which we can pass, about what are the critical scope, and clearly I'm certainly very well aware that the critical scope is the paved area over the structure. I think at the very least, this is what you need to do. However, there is the connection to the rest of the landscape, and you can't necessarily solve this one piece without looking at other critical areas. And part of it is the practical side of it, if you're having construction people come in to do the paved area over the structure, I can pretty much guarantee you that they're not going to be surgically precise enough to look in here, solve this issue, have it button up and very neatly walk away. In all likelihood, when that paved area over the structure gets repaved to address the engineering concerns, the lower edge of that pavement from here all the way to here is probably not going to meet the existing walkway. I can't guarantee that, but it is I won't say it's a foregone conclusion, but it pretty much would be a miracle for that to happen. So if you're going to look at what the critical portion of it is, that's the critical portion. But now you also have to address how that connects to the larger context of these walkways and how it connects to entrances that are coming in. If you have construction companies that are coming in to access this, this is going to be destroyed anyway. So you're going to have to put something back in its place. And the choice is to either put it back exactly the way it is, not meet ADA code, miss the opportunity to improve the space, because you're going to be spending the money anyway. You're going to need to spend the money anyway, regardless of whether it's an aesthetic issue or an engineering issue. This walkway is not going, the walkway that's existing here is not going to survive the construction of what's happening there. It simply won't happen. And then as that filters out into this walkway, then that also filters into the connection to the existing walkways that are here. So realistically, the project is probably a larger scope than what you think it is.
So I would say what you've just done is much more helpful than presenting first a beautiful picture.
We couldn't get to that until we examined the site, looked at the aesthetic concerns, looked at the engineering concerns, looked at the grading, and solved that in a diagrammatic manner that it's almost asking us to do quantum design. You don't jump from understanding a site immediately to this diagram. That's just not possible. And it's the process of design. Design is about problem solving. First and foremost, design is about problem solving. Only secondarily is it about things like aesthetics, and I would even go so far as to say material choices. But it's really about problem solving. In order to solve the problem, You have to identify the problem and logically look at how this problem radiates out into the landscape, radiates out into any adjacent space that's happening. And that is, I hate to say the value added, but that is the value of hiring an architect, or the value of hiring a landscape architect, is that they're going to give you a holistic solution. And in my view, I think the best thing that I do for a client is give them a holistic solution that is in their best interest in the long run. It may not be something that you can afford all at once, but you now have, and you will have, a structure to look at and refer to over time to get you to a point where you're solving a multitude of problems with a single vision. And that's really where we're going. That's really what we're trying to achieve here.
So Chris, if we only had another 20 minutes to discuss, what would you want to get out of us to put Zen Associates in the best position to give us the highest quality design outcome for our precious few design dollars?
Well, I think right now, I've actually, in these discussions, and this happened on the East End too. It's not unusual. It happens on a lot of projects, and it's part of what brings success to the project is all the angst and the feedback and the worry. Hearing all of that is my job. So, and being able to now absorb that, synthesize that into another plan, very similar to what we did in the East End, and come back to you guys with another plan that is more refined than this, that looks in more depth at the grading. It would be a holistic solution, and delivering something that would put your minds at ease, that you know that we have heard what your concerns are, and still we're solving the problems that are existing on the site, sort of through the lens of what your concerns are. So Bob, that's not the, it's not a list of what I need from you guys. It's actually just an acknowledgement that this discussion is exactly what the designer needs to go to the next step and to absorb the concerns that you guys have in terms of things like the covered walkway. Clearly that was something that was important to one of you. The play structure was clearly important to others at previous meetings and those sorts of things. It's just kind of the process. I think this next step will be looking at the engineering solutions in more depth, very similar to what we did in the East End, and hopefully going from there.
So what I'm hearing is that we should stop holding back. We should stop being so damn polite and just kind of let you know.
Well, you guys are tough customers.
No, but seriously, I think when you hear from one person that, about the play structure being, in the size of the glade, it's safe to assume that it's not just
one person. Exactly. There's always the one person that speaks up and the 10 people that are behind him or her. So that's certainly not lost on me.
Yeah, I don't think anything has been said today that is not a widely shared viewpoint.
I would stress strongly that maintaining the covered walkway is something that a lot of people feel strongly about.
Okay.
And you're going forward.
Should we do a rapid fire, laundry list of things that are important to us?
May I ask a question first? So I really appreciate you saying how the interaction is important. That basically that walkway may get destroyed in redoing the paved over areas. Is there anything else that is of top concern that may get affected if we were to do these two projects?
Well, top concern is something that you guys would have to tell me, to be honest with you. I mean, there are going to be
terms of, I mean, what you told us is that path or the walkways may get destroyed.
Sure.
If there's something else like that that really requires our attention?
I think, you know, I know that you guys value trees. That's always something that's hard to evaluate how much of the trees can be saved. And then if you get into a situation where you do a heroic effort to save a tree, inevitably the tree trees don't necessarily show the damage to them until years after construction operations have finished. So I would say that trees would be a concern. That's really...
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, if I heard you correctly, you were saying on the paved area, basically the paths are going to get ruined, get ruined by the equipment. Is there something else like that that will be a collateral damage of doing this that we need to know about now?
Well, collateral, there'll be, like I said, the trees, adjacent landscape areas. You know, there might be places where people have private gardens where just in order to get access to these spaces to do the structures and things like that, you have to think that there is subsurface drainage systems that are going to be designed that may impact surface treatments, may impact plantings. I mean, for the most part, we try not to impact significant trees or things along those lines, but going through, and that's another issue of collaboration where the landscape architect and the civil engineer talk back and forth about how to put these systems in place and save as much trees as possible. I mean, that's going to be something to consider. Something else to consider is just structurally, not so much structurally, but how your life is going to be impacted by the construction is also something to just be aware of.
Gee, I'm not sure how to ask my question.
Okay.
Because what I'm really trying to find out, what was great to discover, that we will have to do something with the paths just because we're doing the paved over. But right now, those seem to be the only two, or unless there's something else that we really have to do once we decide to do the paved over structure.
For example, will the fences be damaged and need replacing? Will the walkways of adjacent properties like 101, things like that?
I see what you're saying.
Will that be ripped up?
101, I'm sorry, bear with me. 101 is the property on the lower left of this diagram in particular?
Yes.
Probably not if it's just working in the lawn areas, in the lawn area and the pavement over structure. That probably would not be affected. But, you know, it does come down to what is the final scope of work that you guys would like to address. I think we're looking at the master plan to address all the issues, and then to, very similar to the East End, define the scope of work that will be phase one. And then to examine that scope of work in more detail, to come up with construction drawings. In the construction drawing process, it would be discussions with with whoever's constructing the project to look at things like, I mean, there are going to be practical considerations. You can't, if we want to dive into practical considerations for a minute, the parking in the drive, for instance, we can't store materials there because that's deeded space. So where are you going to store pallets of pavers? Probably in the lawn, which means the lawn is gone, or will have to be in some way revitalized. there are some perimeter things like fencing along the street that may not be impacted. But if in this instance we're suggesting relocating the secondary entry so that it's accessible, that will impact other aspects of things as well. The walls, the fencing in the front, those sorts of things. I mean, it's really the process of defining the scope of work for what is phase one, identifying what phase one will be. And that's just looking at the west end. That doesn't even begin the discussion of looking at the problems that are happening in the east end, as well as the problems that are happening here in the west end, and prioritizing them. I don't think that's in our scope of work currently to figure out, but there is going to be a point at which the east end and the west end needs to be merged. The priorities need to shake out for budgeting and those sorts of things, and definitions of scope of work need to be determined from there. I don't imagine that this is going to be a one-phase project at all.
Speaking of which, while people are thinking of important messages and questions for you, can you quickly show us phasing?
Phasing?
You were you referred to phasing diagrams,
which were just these two diagrams of looking at what is critical versus what is the recommended scope to take into account. I think that we're kind of a little soon on phasing, because I think we do need to go through the process that we went through on the east end for developing this plan, the second round, getting into certainly the grading layer, doing a fine grading plan. What I did for the east end between meetings, between presentations, was bumping up that plan with more grading information. I don't know if that's helpful to show to this group right now, what we did for the east end, but
unless someone requests it, I think one quick comment at the end of the last discussion we all had together, Scott suggested putting at a lower priority the walkways along the train tracks.
Yes.
So give the highest priority. Is that a reasonable thing to expect? That would be an okay thing to do? Just look at the patio and the walkways and plantings in that front green area.
I think that's reasonable, with the caveat that I'm not sure what the civil engineers subsurface structures, how much the civil engineers subsurface structures are tied to the rear. I don't know how much water is going out the back of the property, and whether that would need to be captured in the civil, in any sort of civil drain system.
Hey, Chris?
Yep.
And Joan, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. The one other thing I thought of that you were asking about that does have an impact with the construction is all the doorways. All the doors and doorways along the patio are going to have major reconstructive surgery to make sure that after the patio is ripped up, that no water will come back, into the units themselves. So that's an area that's going to be disrupted for a little while, along with anything that's planted along the patio, not in the tree boxes, but just planted on the lawn in that area. So that whole area is going to get, have a hard time keeping that the same as it looks right now. But to answer some of Ann's things with the civil engineering, we've been talking to the civil engineers, about these things. And now we have somebody coming out next week from the civil engineering office that's going to, talk about all these things, but there is no interesting topics to talk about with the civil engineer. You think this is, boring. You sit and discuss the drainage with the civil engineer. You're not going to want to know. So he's going to basically listen to and follow Chris's lead as to where things need to go, which is critical. Because I've done this before in other complexes where we just tear up an old patio and replace it with new concrete. And then afterwards, everyone says, well, where are the gardens going to go? Where can we put plants now? Where's the water going into? There's just, it is the wrong way to do it, is to do the underground work and then get above ground and say, okay, what do we do now? It's definitely not the right way to do it. You're doing it the right way with Chris. And the civil is going to give us the solutions to the underground, which there's not many options. He's going to do what he's trained to do and what the city and the town will allow him to do. So the most important part is what happens after he puts his pipes in the ground, and what does it look like above ground? Because we're trying to solve a design defect, really, and it's not simple.
And on top of that, one thing that I would add to that too is that really the role of the landscape architect or the architect is always to be the advocate for the client. That is the unspoken rule. So, and spoken rule, I'll honestly have to say, we are the advocate for you guys to look at things in a larger picture. It may not feel that way right now, but I hope you trust me. And one of the things, to get back to a little bit of the discussion back and forth with the civil engineers, that the civil engineer is also going to look for a solution that is calculation based, that is going to kind of ramrod I shouldn't characterize it this way, but sort of ramrod a solution into a site regardless of what the end look is going to be. It's just really getting water from point A to point B is what they do. They're very good at it. It would bore me to tears to live that lifestyle, but they're very good at what they do. We need
to understand, because we were presented with this as a drainage problem.
Yep.
So we, as a community, need to understand that that is really being taken care of. So you're right, Scott. My mind doesn't work in such a way that I want to sit and listen to the civil engineer talk about where he's putting pipes. But I need to be really assured that that problem is getting taken care of before we get pretty. And I really understand that Chris is not just making pretty, but unless you've gone through this process, some people are not going to understand that.
It's scary, and one of our failures, and I'm glad that you bring it. I'm glad that you bring it up, and I'm glad that you bring up the idea of frustration. Is that sometimes designers are not the best at articulating process, or we sometimes take for granted the fact that we've done this process so many times that for us it's sort of second nature. There is a little bit of a leap of faith, and I don't know how else to explain it. And perhaps I could be better at assuaging your anxiety.
Well, sadly or not sadly, you are working with a community of people that I don't know exactly how to define us, but we're going to ask a lot of questions and be very skeptical. So it's the nature of us, I think.
Well, let me tell you about architecture school. And Bob's probably chuckling over there because architecture school is basically having professionals who are far more knowledgeable than on many, many topics, basically grilling you for, in my case, 7.5 years. So it's something that you really can't give me any feedback that I'm going to take personally. And
I'm trying so hard.
But it is the crucial feedback that, and it is part of the process. It is, unfortunately, and I wish I could take that aspect out of my profession, but there is really this very uncomfortable stage, and we're going in the right direction. I think that everything that we've done in all of the meetings has, on balance, been very positive. So again, I would just ask to bear with me a little bit, take a little bit of a leap of faith, understand that it is my job to advocate for you. And I don't know what else to say.
Any last questions?
Other than, what are our next steps?
Next steps on my end, I think that that it'll be useful. Bob always takes very good notes. I'm assuming that he's done that today. I will probably circle back with Scott to talk about next steps, which I imagine will be, if the community is comfortable doing this, going to the next step of what we did for the East End, which was, again, a more comprehensive look at grading and solving all of the issues, taking into account the feedback that we've received to date. In the background, some of the things that you guys don't see, which is moving the project forward, is coordination with the civil engineer. I had a conversation with the civil engineer very recently about the site, shared the survey information. So I need to talk to Scott about how that's being contracted moving forward. And I imagine that the next step is a refined site plan, and going directly to what we didn't do on the East End, which we might consider doing this time, and would be to go to a more finalized site plan and immediately engage the civil engineer, which I think will put to ease, or will help put to ease, some of the trepidation about how we're moving forward, so that you guys can then hear from both myself and the civil engineer to see what the solutions are. I think that might be the best way to move forward.
Yep. Right now, Chris, it's looking like Wednesday or Thursday I'll be walking over the site with him.
Okay.
So we're on our way, and he's gotten all the past paperwork and information, so it'll be pretty quick.
Yeah, I bet. When I talked to him, he right away jumped to permitting, to be honest with you.
Yeah. So Chris, on the next steps phase of this, is there a way that we could take an overlay of what you feel strongly about with the walkway? You know, like we've been talking a little bit around, ADA compliance for the walkways.
Yeah,
but
I can look specifically at the walkway and look at doing a grading study of that, and maybe that is the interim step.
It seems like there's concern about that.
Yeah,
I think it'd be a good step. That, and then the planters, because if those trees have to go, and that patio has to be torn up, it seems like that's another big area of concern.
Sure. I mean, what I could potentially do as a next go around is, instead of doing such a formalized presentation, is really just doing a couple grading overlay studies that will get the civil engineer wrapped around his brain, wrapped around what I'm thinking in terms of surface drainage. Look at a couple options for how we are going to address the spine. That would be short time. I can't imagine that taking a long time to come up with something diagrammatic that addresses those things. And then, reporting back to the committee to focus in on the central area, to focus in on really this central area.
Yeah, it's really what's broken, and it's what everyone wants to know how we're going to fix.
Sure. No, it seems very reasonable for a next step.
Okay.
So I'm advertising a document in the chat. If you feel that every concern that any of your neighbors or you could possibly have about this project, great, thank you very much. But if there's a small detail or a huge detail or a question, or you want to rant, there's a document for that, and it's the link to it is there in the chat. And if you can't open the chat, I can send it. It already is in the email that you've already received as an invitation to this discussion. So I see we're over time. How is everybody? Is this okay?
Yeah, I think it's good, Bob.
Okay, well, great. Thank you everyone for participating, and thank you so much, Chris and Scott, for being here.